Welcome, everyone, to the first episode of The Creator Consult, a podcast produced by Scruffy Chandelier Productions dedicated to the specific crafts and lives behind all creators. From what are your creative pursuits, what drives you, and how do you improve in your craft? This episode, we're sitting down with a longtime friend of mine, Michael Cooper, who is first and foremost an author, but also wears many hats in the creative world, having done stand-up comedy, filmmaking, and has also had some experience with playwriting. So, Michael, it's great to have you on the show today.
Thank you, Ryan. It's a pleasure to be here.
Now, as we mentioned at the top here, you have had quite a creative journey, kind of delving into a lot of different areas. Can you give us a little bit more about your story as a creator?
Well, I've always been a creative sort ever since I was young. I used to draw a lot. I actually started writing stories when I was in elementary school.
Oh, wow.
The earlier stories were monster stories because I'm totally obsessed with monsters. And then when I moved over to high school years, I would write horror stories. It was during the 80s. And not to say that I chased the trends, but it was really predominant. It was during the time of splatterpunk was a literary movement at the time. I don't know if you're familiar with that or not, which where stories were very extreme with violence, sexual content, language. And I wrote a lot of what could really be considered splatterpunk stories. Now, as I got older, I kind of left that behind and got married, had a child, basically full on adulting, as they call it now. Yeah, they didn't call it adulting then, but basically living my life. Well, in 2011, I came down with necrotizing fasciitis, the flesh eating bacteria, and it really just turned my world upside down. And I had not really been creating. I had kind of just been working, going home, raising my child. And after necrotizing fasciitis, which took a very long time to recover from, I decided that I was going to start pursuing a creative track again. It basically comes down to making the most of the time you have. So I started doing stand-up comedy, doing open mic nights, and I decided that I wanted to go back to school and get my degree. So I went to UAB to get a film degree, and I took screenwriting, I took playwriting, which really kind of opened up a lot of doors that I had kept closed for many years. Did some PSAs, some short subjects, and then the play got picked, and then I took some creative writing classes. So what I have tried to do is, since recovering, which really the recovery is kind of an ongoing thing, I've tried to keep myself busy creating. And when COVID hit and I was no longer able to get out and do film, I decided I was going to start writing, and it just kind of went from there.
And I know from the part of your journey where you were talking about UAB, that's where you and I met for the first time, was one of
Yes,
the filmmaking classes. Who is that that's joining us on the mic here?
that would be George, my 22-pound tabby, who likes to let everybody know that he's here. This is his house, and I just rent it from him.
Well, we're happy to have George on the podcast too.
I didn't want to be that guy, but yes, I'm the guy on the Zoom call that's got the cattail on his face.
To speak to part of your journey, though, I remember that was the first time that I learned about your journey with necrotizing fasciitis when we were working on that PSA project. We ended up doing a PSA on suicide prevention, but that was the other leading idea that was pitched at that time. And I remember we had some discussions about your struggles with that and how that impacted your life. And that was a big thing, and something that honestly I wish we had done a PSA on that. I think that would have been a great PSA to do.
Thank you. One of the things that I say about that time in my life is not many people get a second chance. Nobody gets a third chance. There probably be people, oh, no, that's not true. Well, in my experience, it is, because the doctor told me, I don't know if I ever told you this, he said, if you get sick again, you will die. And that is a rather sobering statement to hear. So I've tried to apply that to my life, to take more chances, to be more bold. Because before necrotizing fasciitis, I spent a lot of my life living in fear. Fear of the unknown, fear of taking a chance. The very first time I did stand-up comedy, they made me go first.
Really?
Yeah. And I had a lot of friends and family, and I thought one of two things is going to happen. Either I'm going to do okay, or it's going to be a really awkward Thanksgiving coming up. I just went out there and did it. There was a time before I got sick that I would never have even tried. I wouldn't even have gone out on the stage. And let me make clear, I am not a victim. I am a survivor. So I try to make the most of any opportunity that comes my way.
That's definitely a powerful story, and I thank you for sharing that with everybody. I think myself coming from a medical background, even though it sounds like the bedside manner maybe had a little bit to be desired there, I think it is powerful that you took a darker message and turned it into something positive in your life to really seize the day and
Carpe that diem.
absolutely just really charge forward with doing the things that you wanted to do.
Well, to be frank, I was at a place in my life where I had two choices. And it's funny the things that you will comprehend or understand or come up with when your choices are taken away. When you're stripped bare, that's when you really find out what you're made out of. And that sounds like a cliche. That sounds corny. That sounds like coming up next on Lifetime Movie Network. But it's true. I had two choices. Either I was going to lay there and die, or I was going to get up off of my rear and make something of my life and make the best of the time that I have. There's a movie line that I love, and it fits so well into my situation. The line is, let me make sure I get the quote right. They tell me, my memory sometimes is not that good, that it's probably because I was on the vent so long. Yeah, I was on the vent a long time. But anyway, the quotation is, hell is just a word. The reality is much, much worse.
Mm.
And that is true.
But hey, you came back, you like you said, carpe that diem,
And carpe that diem, yes, sir.
and among all the creative things that you've made, we're here to talk about one thing very special today. I introduced you at the top of the podcast first and foremost as an author, and you've had a lot of writing experience, but today we are here to talk about your first book that you've published, By Blood Be Thou Redeemed. To start things off for our listeners that maybe have not yet had a chance to read the book, give them a little synopsis.
The book deals with Josh Rand, who is a writer. And at one point in time, Josh had quite a bit of success exposing fake healers, religious charlatans. He would write books and exposés about these people, basically tear down their house of cards. Well, the backstory is that at some point, Josh ran into a guy, did an expose of him, and this guy took him to court. And this guy had the money and resources where he basically just tore Josh apart. So we pick up where Josh is no longer famous. He's lost his career, he's lost his marriage, and he desperately wants to get his life back. And he's looking for what he knows. Let's be honest, there's no shortage of people out on the street corner yelling that the end is nigh. Let me show you the real way. So he hears rumors about someone who refers to himself as John Revelator, but the guy's like a ghost. It's like word of mouth, very hush hush. So he's intrigued and he's convinced that this guy's got to be a fake. So he decides, I'm going to get this guy and I'm going to find him and I'm going to get my life back. So he gets his friend, Oscar Potts, who's a private investigator, to help him track down John Revelator. But as he gets closer, things start to happen that may change how he looks at things.
I think that gives everybody kind of a gist of the story that they're walking into. And I'm going to try to keep things pretty spoiler free with my questions here. I have read through the whole book, but I also don't want to give anything away for any of our listeners that have not read the book yet and want to go do so afterwards. You were talking about your main character, Josh. And I remember when I was reading the book, you introduce your main character, Josh Rand, with Josh poured the last of the milk into a bowl and then added cereal that resembled dry leaves. So, why exactly right off the bat did you want to let us know that Josh Rand was a psychopath that puts the milk first? But really, who is Josh? I know that Josh is introduced, like you said, as an author, and the obvious parallel of you being an author. Did you see yourself a lot in Josh as you were writing the story?
Well, first off, the cereal reference kind of is a little nod to a couple things in my life. My mother would give me cereal like that when I was a kid, and I always put the milk first, and my child thinks I'm insane. So when you said that, I couldn't help but laugh because she thinks I'm a psychopath.
Well, now she knows that you have been exposed
I
publicly,
know
and
it's out, everybody. I'm totally I'm insane. I'm completely out of my mind. As to Josh, first off, I never write a character that is me. There are parts that are me or parts that I can relate to. But I feel that if you do that, in my opinion, in my way of working, it's too on the nose. I don't do that.
interesting.
Yeah, I'd never do that because I prefer to make a character to where you can put yourself into the character. And Josh is a character that I relate to. He's someone that has gone through a lot of trauma. He is someone that has lost everything and he's just holding on by a thread. But he has this dogged determination for good or for ill. It's really for you to determine. I usually relate to people that are damaged. So he's the avatar that I choose to tell you the story. Maybe there's a part of me in that because I do come from a Christian background and, I've been coming out of that and I like to write intuitively, if that makes any sense. I kind of get an idea and I just kind of go with it and I kind of let the story tell itself. I've heard authors talk about their characters coming to life. Like I intended to do this, but my character wanted to do that. That is a completely true thing. At least for me, it is. I guess I start out with a character that I can relate to, maybe put some of myself in it. Because the way I tell a story, I immerse myself in the story in that I am telling it to you as I see it, as I hear it, as I smell it, as I taste it, everything. I want it to be a sensory experience as if you were in it, not as though I'm outside of it, very cold and clinical. Maybe it's from being interested in Italian films, very much operatic, a lot of blood and thunder, a lot of passionate emotions.
Right.
So I kind of want you to experience it. So I guess Josh kind of was the character that I latched onto. There's not one particular person that is Josh, but I want him to be distinct, but have enough ambiguity in there to where you can see yourself in it.
It sounds like there's pieces of you that are in Josh, but Josh is, like you said, a vessel that can be a reflection, hopefully, of any reader that is able to see parts of themselves in the character.
Exactly. And the book has my fingerprints all over it. It has pieces of me in it. But I'm not writing an autobiography and I'm not really interested in that. I kind of follow Rod Serling in that there were a lot of things that he wanted to talk about, things like story writing that he wasn't allowed to at the time. So he developed the Twilight Zone and he used a fantasy context to get by the censors because they weren't going to allow him to talk about some of the things he wanted to talk about. So under that cover or veil of fantasy or unreality, he was talking about real things. I'm not saying I'm Rod Serling. I'm not saying this is some masterwork, or I'm just saying that inspired me.
Right. No, well, and I think it's interesting that you comment about trying to immerse yourself and making your book a sensory experience, because I think that is something that, to me, when I was reading your book, a lot of that came across. It was interesting, too, because it came across in ways that there were very serious, enriching parts of that, but there were also parts that I found kind of humorous that altogether helped set the scene. There was one thing in particular that I was thinking about in your world building. You have noted some very specific set pieces that characters have observed in their surroundings to help establish the timeline of the story. For example, the one that comes to mind on page 6 of chapter 2, I had noted that you mention a waitress taking an order for, quote, a young guy in a Minecraft shirt. That was funny to me because I guess now this is something I would play in middle school, and now it's still something that elementary school, middle school age kids are playing, but it kind of established that that was sometime around modern day. And I was wondering, is timing for the story really important? Did you want to make a statement specifically about it being modern day?
Well, I put references in there, and I have a child who has played Minecraft and talked about Minecraft incessantly. Okay.
It's a great game, I gotta say.
I mean, really. So that is in the background, the background radiation. But I wanted to establish a world that you could recognize, a world that you could believe in. There's a theory that I've heard about, writing and even films to where in order to inject something unreal, the real has to be believable. Because if everything's unreal, you don't believe any of it.
Well, and to your point, I think that just makes me more invested in a story when I'm reading it. Because, like you said, if it's something that I don't believe, it's hard for me to get immersed, even if the atmosphere is gripping, if it just doesn't have some part of it grounded in what we see as reality. Our mind doesn't want to immerse ourselves in it because our mind sees it as foreign.
Exactly. And one of the things that I was trying to do is I want to write something that, I mean, obviously, I can't avoid the fact that it's going to be a product of its time. And I like a lot of older movies, a lot of older music. But one thing I wanted to avoid was doing something that is so specific to the time and era that once you're beyond that, you have no context and it doesn't really mean anything to you anymore. But the older things that I like usually have something that is still relevant to me today. Maybe they're talking about something, maybe it's their aesthetics, maybe it's the way they view things. So I want to try to do something that fits into our world now, makes sense now, but you can read it later and you won't think, wow, is this a transmission from an alien planet? Because I just don't get it.
Right, right.
It's kind of walking a line. You know what I mean?
Well, and Minecraft's been going strong for 15 years, so I mean, I think it's going to be timeless.
Oh, I know.
But to your point, I mean, a lot of the details that you list in the book, it does strong world building that doesn't necessarily date the story. There were things that I picked out that were specific to modern time that we have now. But I think you could easily in the future, if it's somebody reading this, 100, 200 years from now, you could easily gloss over the little details about Minecraft and things like that, and it would still feel current.
That was my goal, to be inclusive, to invite people in and to have them invest. Because if, you're going to have my book and you're going to read, it's almost like I'm inviting you into my house. Come in, I'm going to tell you a story. It's my job to be engaging. It's my job to put you at ease, to get you into the story. Then, of course, I can start messing with you and get it a little crazy. If a story is all safe, to me, it's boring. I feel as though I have a responsibility to whoever would read it to be engaging and to be honest, to tell the truth. That's one thing we argue about a lot. A lot of people argue about what is truth, what isn't. As long as I'm being honest about what I feel and what I think, and I'm fine because, hey, it's not my responsibility to tell anybody else about their reality. But I guess, if you're going to read my book, you're already halfway there. So I guess it's my way of saying, hey, come on, I'll tell you the truth. Have a seat. I mean, now I'm going to throw a little fiction in there, but.
Right. To kind of echo something that you said, somebody was telling me something about documentary filmmaking at one point that, I had always thought of documentary filmmaking as it's documentary style. So you are documenting a truthful event, you're documenting something that truly happened. But in every form of art, in every form of delivery of news, if you're introducing a human element, there's going to be some bias and there's going to be some introduction of, well, what exactly is truth? If two people experience the same event in a different way and they describe it in the ways that they experienced, is one of those untruthful just because they're different, but seeing the same thing? I don't know. That just made me think, what you were saying made me think of that, about how you can experience things in different ways and putting out the truth, but the truth can mean different things to different people.
Exactly. And one of the ideas that I've kind of adopted is when someone tells me they read my book or they watched my short film or whatever, if they tell me I got this from it, I generally don't tell them they're wrong because I want you to make up your own mind. I don't need anyone else to tell me how to think, and you don't need me to tell you how to think. You make up your own mind what it means to you. And if you come up with something totally different, I mean, then that's valid for you. And I've told people, hey, if you're going to read the book, leave a review. If you love it, fine. If you hate it, fine. Tell me. It's fine. Because my goal is to continuously get better as I keep writing. If I wrote By Blood Be Thy Redeemed today, I would probably do it differently. Most likely, I would do it differently. But I'm going to leave it as it is, warts and all, because it's a document of when I wrote it.
Right. No, I think that's definitely an interesting point because, I mean, looking back at some of the film work that we did together in school too, of course, almost every old video I look at, I think about how I would do things differently now with the knowledge I have as my current me. But I think it, like you said, it is good to kind of keep things as they were and look back on yourself and your growth from that point, and also appreciate what you did at the time with the skills that you had at that time too. Speaking to that, with that time, we were talking about this being kind of a modern day piece. I don't want to give anything away about the story, but I know you and I have talked a little bit outside of the podcast about some of the life circumstances that were surrounding you as you were writing this first book. There were definitely undertones that I felt were referring to the pandemic that we were all experiencing. So I guess thinking about what was going on in your life at the time, were there parts of the book that were inspired by the COVID-19 pandemic?
It was such a pervasive element. The fear. I remember a lot of fear everywhere in everybody. So there are a lot of elements of it in the book. Yes, I don't specifically refer to that, but I actually, while I was writing it, I originally wrote it and it was only 13 chapters. And I got some feedback and I decided to expand it. I had been very sick for a few weeks. I went to the doctor, and this is all during the process of writing and revising, which it's a beautiful process, but there are times when you'll want to pull your eyeballs out, which I did at many times where I'm like, if I have to read this one more time, but hey, this is the life we choose.
The tortured life of a creator.
Exactly, like I'm some mob boss. This is the life we chose. You know what I'm talking about over there? I was very sick, and they discovered that I had a heart condition. I was having PVCs, and my heart capacity was at 10%. So they were going to do an arteriogram, and I had to get a COVID test. I had tested a couple weeks prior, and I'd come up negative. But the day I had to go get the arteriogram, they came out and said, "We can't do this. You have COVID. You have to go home." So I went home and I'm in quarantine. They couldn't see me again for 3 weeks. So they kept me in quarantine for 3 weeks. And there were days that I couldn't get up. Well, I could get up, make it to the couch. Then I would fall asleep. I was very sick. I couldn't wash dishes. I couldn't make dinner. I couldn't do anything. So that obviously is in the background. But I didn't want to literally put my character down like that, if I may make a point of something that I did consciously put in there.
Absolutely.
There is, not to give any spoilers away, but there is a part where something happens, tragic, and a character, they mourn, but they make it clear that they want to move on and they want to keep going. And my whole thing was, number one, if this character goes down into depression for the rest of this book, this is going to be boring. I might as well be painting a picket fence in slow motion to sleepy classical music. You know what I mean?
Right.
But it was also about how you can react to tragedy. Everybody reacts to tragedy, whatever form that may take. So maybe subconsciously, this was a part of me saying, this is really tragic because the doctor told me, we're not going to let it get to this, but you could get to a point where you're here one moment and you're gone the next, just like that. The doctor also told me we can't wait 2 weeks. I had to have an arteriogram and then later I had to have an ablation. The doctor told me we can't wait 2 weeks. It was that serious. Well, that next week I get told I got COVID and I've got 3 weeks of quarantine.
That was a nightmare in the pandemic. I remember from my side of things, being a medical student, seeing patients in the hospital. We had patients that were quarantined with pretty severe cases of COVID, but also needed care from other teams in the hospital. But there were restrictions on who could be seeing patients because especially early on in the pandemic, the fear of spreading it around to patients with serious pulmonary conditions or serious heart conditions was a big fear. But then people aren't getting the care that they need in the time that they need it. And at least from what I observed, hearing your story to this point, it was a nightmare.
It was. And the desperation in the story, the feeling of being up against overwhelming odds, but still wanting to move forward is real. The circumstances, of course, are fictional, the details are fictional, but the emotion is real. And I try to write from a very real place. How am I feeling? What am I thinking? So that made its way into the piece. Again, I try to leave enough ambiguity in there so that you can put whatever you want in there because tragedy takes many different forms for many different people. And I try to put in there to where you can see yourself in this. And another thing that I try to do is I try to have characters that make smart decisions. And if they make dumb decisions, you need to know why. Maybe they can't admit something. Maybe they're stubborn. Maybe they're blinded by something. Because how many times have you read a book and you say, I'm going to take this book and throw it out the window because they're making these really ridiculous decisions? It's the same thing with movies.
Because if you don't see the motivation, it's one of those things that for me, it takes me out of the story. It's like, well, that doesn't make any sense why this person would do what they're doing.
Exactly. Like, is it really a good idea to go have a picnic at Dead Teenager Rock on the 100th anniversary of the teenagers who died at Dead Teenager Rock? Is it really that great of an idea? And if it is, why is it such a great idea?
Well, I don't know about you, but that sounds delightful.
Well, it does. I'd watch the movie, and I probably have some movies that have that plot. But my point is, you just want to scream. So I try to take that out of it. Well, number one, it's a selfish reason. I don't want to hear it. I don't. People love to critique, and that's fine because when you're putting your work out there, people critique, and they should. And if people don't like it, that's fine. But you got to know what kind of heart goes into it and what kind of work goes into it. I mean, you know as well as I do in film work and writing, and we learned in school, you've got to be in love with the red pen. You've got to be in love with editing. How many times did we have a plan A, but we switched to B? We couldn't do that. We went to C, and then we had to go to D. Then we had to use elements of A. How many times did that happen to where your product looks nothing like what you thought it was going to look?
So much. And I would argue that I don't think I've ever created anything that's been exactly what I envisioned it to be. Everything always turns out a little bit different.
It does because of logistics, because things change. Sometimes perception changes, but you need to be true to yourself in the moment. Like with my story, you may not want to do this, but a lot of times I fly by the seat of my pants. I may have an idea of where I want to go, but that could change in the course of the story. And that can be an exhilarating and a terrifying thing.
For sure. Well, Mike, I think you've already shared a lot of really insightful information about your book that anybody listening could certainly apply to their own writing and their own work in a larger context in the creative world. One thing that I'm really setting out to do with this podcast series, having these conversations with creators, is I want this to be a place for creators on the rise that they can take away lessons from this podcast and learn things to apply to their own work. And so I think to wrap up this interview, I would want to ask you, for anybody out there that's listening that is getting their start as an author, that's wanting to take that first step, write their first book, write their first piece that they want to publish, is there any big advice that you can take from your experience to kind of boil it down to one point that you would want to make sure that aspiring authors know?
If I had to boil it down to just one thing, is do it. Put yourself out there and do it. And if you fail, learn and move on. And don't give up, because there are any number of people that will tell you you cannot do it. It's ridiculous. Nobody wants to read a book anymore. Whatever it is. If it is in your heart, do it. Whether it's writing, whether it's painting, whether it's drawing, whether it's acting, singing, playing an instrument, get out there and do it. And don't, well, I don't want to say don't listen to criticism, because some criticism is valid and we need criticism to learn.
Listen to constructive criticism, but
Exactly.
just blind criticism.
Yeah,
You don't need that.
Yeah, there's plenty of people that will discourage you. Just get out there and learn. And if I had to throw another one in for free, if you're going to write, you need to read. You need to read a lot, and you need to vary your reading, because you need to know your field. You need to know what you're getting into. And the last thing I would say, be true to yourself. You write something that you're proud of and something that you feel good about, and everything else will work itself out. As long as you're willing to do the work, you'll get there. So just do it.
Well, there you go. You get 3 for the price of 1 on advice from Michael this podcast. Michael, thank you so much for joining us today and
Pleasure.
sharing some info, speaking about your book, and giving us some tips.
Thank you.
I know that you have another book out as well, and so we will have to have you on the podcast again soon to talk about your other work.
Absolutely. Anytime.
Michael, to close us out, where can people find your book and where can people keep up with you?
I have an author page on Instagram, Michael W. Cooper, author. You can find me there, and that's where I'll post updates. I have personal, but it's more of a personal thing. So if you want to find me at Michael W. Cooper, author on Instagram, I have an author page on Amazon. You can just look me up. My books are all linked, so you can find them. You can get Kindle editions, you can get paperbacks, or if you want to go old school, you can get hardbacks. Just look up my name. Actually, on my Instagram, I have a link to my author page. So you can go there and it'll list the books that I have. You can reach out to me, message me if you have any feedback. I'm willing to talk to anyone. I'm always glad to talk to people that have enjoyed the book. And even if you didn't, we can always talk about it. It's perfectly fine. I love to hear from people. I'm out there. Hit me up.
Well, wonderful, Michael. Thank you so much again for joining us, and we will catch you next time.
Take care.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of the Creator Consult. Whatever your creative passion, we hope you found some helpful tips and motivating words in this episode and enjoyed our conversation. Feel free to engage with us on social media. You can find the Creator Consult by Scruffy Chandelier Productions on X and Instagram at the Scruffy C. That's at THE_SCRUFFY_C at the Scruffy C. Join the Scruffy Chandelier Productions Discord server to join behind-the-scenes conversations for creators or regarding other Scruffy Chandelier Productions content. You can also join the conversation in the video comments on my YouTube channel. All the links can be found in the episode description below. Now get out there and learn, create, and enjoy your passions. And we'll see you in the next episode of the Creator Consult.